So also, I'm not sure how many of you have been here last year, but I made an intro with the famous opening of June, and I heard people loved it, and I was like, okay, I need to do something like that again. And I was like, okay, what other famous movie opening prologues are there? So there is Dune, there is Lord of the Rings, which I did at Objective by the Sea a few years ago, and there is Star Wars, and apparently there isn't too much else. So obviously, I did perfect. Something completely different. So let's see if it works with sound. I hope you will recognize from where it is, and it's a bit long, and it's more like an opening theme for the whole conference, not just for this talk. Okay. Let's put this. So if you didn't recognize this is a really old game called Monkey Island from 1990, and actually it was available for macOS that time. And I highly recommend playing it if you haven't done it, because it's full of jokes. It's really funny. And it has like 5 parts now. But back to the talk. Few words about myself. I work at Kanji as a macOS researcher. I do vulnerability research primarily, and also tuning our EDR and improving the detection of our product. I used to work at OffSec, where I wrote macOS exploitation training. I used to work as a red blue teamer, so attack defense. And I also do macOS bug hunting even before Kanji. I'm now over 100 CVs with Apple. I'm married, have 2 kids, and I'm really into running. So this talk is about the macOS security history, but not, I think it's not exactly in a way you expect it to be. So I will not, or mostly I will not list like, okay, this is TCC, the privacy feature, this is what we had in Mojave, Catalina, Vixer, etc. But more like how Apple made my life as a vulnerability researcher more difficult and how it made the OS more secure for all the users. I will do some feature history overview with big OS version, where I think there was like a major jump, but overall it's like a mix of everything. So the agenda is, first I will start with GateKeeper improvements, then kernel extension mitigations and improvements, TCC, then process injection, which we heard a lot about from Wojciech in the previous talk, then launch constraints, which I think one of the most powerful mitigation in the past few years, and how Apple is closing weaponization paths. So GateKeeper. Before I jump into GateKeeper, I want to clarify one thing, because I think what most people refer to as GateKeeper in general is in fact not GateKeeper. What I think usually we say under GateKeeper is really a mix of 3 different technologies, which is file quarantine, GateKeeper, because we do have a GateKeeper, and Xprotect. So when we say GateKeeper, we usually mean these 3 together. So if you get this prompt, that's actually file quarantine and not GateKeeper. So what are these? So file quarantine is basically when you download an application from the internet, the operating system will ask you for, like a user consent to run that application. It's called mark of the web on the OS, which shall not be named here. We also have GateKeeper, which comes after file quarantine or together with that. This is the functionality where it actually verifies the code signature of the application and ensures that it conforms to the policy configured by the user. So if you said that I only allow to run App Store application, then GateKeeper will be the one that ensures that if you downloaded something from the internet, it will not run. It's responsible for verifying notarization, etc. This one can be disabled. If you disable GateKeeper, you will still get this pop-up. And we have Xprotect, which is basically Apple's malware scanning engine. So when you basically download an application, execute it, you get all these 3. Before Mojave, how this feature came in, back in Leopard, file quarantine was introduced. Then in Snow Leopard, Xprotect came. Lion, the SPCTL command was introduced, but I think there was no actual GateKeeper. And that Mountain Lion GateKeeper came. So let's start the journey with Mojave. I had a talk that time that I called GateKeeper bypass or not bypass. I was still new to the field, and I was like, okay, if I download an application and just go to the terminal and execute it from there, it runs. I don't get any pop-up or anything. Is it a feature or a bug? Is it intended or not? Basically, you could bypass GateKeeper with just executing something. So GateKeeper were only integrated into launch services. So whenever you would double click or said open the application, then it was triggered. If you actually executed through the traditional POSIX way, then it wasn't invoked. And it wasn't a bypass, it was a feature. Because then Catalina came, And they said, okay, we will integrate GateKeeper into the spawn exec portion as well. They also introduced notarization, but you could still bypass GateKeeper with the user right-click opening the application. And actually, up until Sequoia, this was the most fundamental prompt in every single macOS malware. All of them said, okay, you downloaded it, right-click open, and that's the way to execute it. If you see anything similar like this, where it says you need to right-click open, that's 100% sure it's malware. Or the user is too lazy to notarize the application. In Sequoia, they removed the right-click override. Now, if you really want to run it, you need to do more effort. So the user have to go into system setting, etc. This, from a vulnerability research perspective, it didn't really complicate my life, but definitely the malware authors' life. Kernel extensions. Now, these are the kernel drivers on macOS. If you can load a kernel extension, you get kernel code execution. So it's been a long time target for exploits. In Yosemite, Apple introduced that they require a crack signing certificate. High Sierra, they introduced this secure kernel extension loading, which essentially means that the user have to approve the kernel extension to be loaded. Now, it was bypassed by Patrick Wardle a few times back at High Sierra. Basically, what he did, he achieved the bypass via synthetic mouse events. So he wrote like a tool which navigated the mouse and clicked to approve the kernel extension, and SKEL was bypassed. Now, just bypassing SKEL, how does it give you kernel code execution? So there are a ton of third-party drivers, and let's say you find a vulnerability in any of them. It's a signed driver, so it will be loaded by the operating system. And if you can bypass SKEL, you can load the vulnerable driver, and then you can exploit the vulnerability in the driver. And you can always use that old driver with the vulnerability because its code signature is valid. So on the other OS, this is actually a huge problem. It even has a name, this technique, bring your own vulnerable driver. And there are like tons of web pages, projects on GitHub that, hey, this is the driver, this is the vulnerability in the driver, this is the exploit, just run it and you get kernel code execution. If you just search for BYOVD, this is like the just tip of the iceberg. So there, it's a massive problem. I will get back to this. So we passed the SKEL era, and in 2020, we had attacks where a group of people at Pwn2Own managed to bypass the code signing verification process. So they could load an unsigned kernel extension, so basically any custom driver. They did some file system tricks using symlinks, so they could basically start loading an Apple signed driver. Once the verification was done, they swapped the symbolic link pointing to another driver, and basically that custom driver was loaded into the OS. That was in Catalina. I think the first release or something like that. So that was fixed. Then I found the bypass for that fix. It was fixed in 2021, I think in 15.6, something like that. Basically the same story. I could still find a way to use symbolic links to do the same trick. Start loading an Apple signed driver. Once it's verified, swap the symbolic link and load my own driver. And it seemed that these things are really hard to patch with the file system stuff, and it didn't seem that it will go away in the long run. So this, like trying to bypass signature validation began to be like an attack surface. And then came Big Sur in Catalina, and Apple did two major changes for the kernel loading process. First one was they staged all the kernel extensions into the auxiliary kernel extension collection, which was zip protected. And let's say you manage to still load something in there. In order to be loaded in that kernel collection, you had to bypass signature validation already. But let's say you bypass that, then in order to load the kernel extension, you had to reboot the machine. And basically, after you rebooted it, Apple took the kernel extension collection and did an extra validation during boot time where you had no possibility to mess around. And basically, these two ended this attack surface. I still had a bug, like I had a bug in Big Sur where I could bypass the first items. I managed to load my unsigned kernel extension into the kernel extension collection so I could stage my driver. But again, I had to reboot the machine, and then code validation failed during boot time because, of course, it wasn't signed. The only known bypass for this entire thing came from Mickey Jin, and he could only do that in Intel without a T2 chips. So it's a pretty limited stuff. He gave a talk about this. Now, SKEL bypass could still work. So you could still load like a vulnerable driver and exploit it to gain kernel code execution if you can bypass the user approval. And now Apple Silicon came, and basically Apple said, no more CACs for third parties, unless you allow it in recovery mode. But I would say you shouldn't. I think there is an endless debate in the security community if Apple is right about this or not. I think they are seeing it on Windows, how big issue it is, or the third-party drivers. I think they are right. So it's a major attack surface reduction. And the other side of the claim says, OK, if you want to do a security product, and if you are not in the kernel, you cannot do anything if an attacker attacks the kernel. But if someone gets kernel code execution, like a malicious person, they can already do anything. They can disable your security product from the kernel. So it's already game over, almost. So yeah, it's a cat and mouse game, but I think doing this, I feel it's right. Other people probably don't, but yeah. So TCC, everyone's favorite prompt. It's the transparency, consent, and control. It's basically the feature that's protecting your private data. It was introduced in Mountain Lion, and in Mojave, it got like a major extension with lots of new categories. And since then, we almost see new categories every single release. I'm not sure if there are any new in Tahoe, but it's already a huge list of various privacy items. Now, TCC defines a set of places where it thinks it should be protected. So let's say you have your contacts in the library application support address book folder. That's where the contacts are stored. And that's what Apple is thinking as well. It turned out that your private data is just everywhere else as well, because some daemons applications are making a copy of your private data for their own use, or they just cache the data for their own use, or whatever, or it shows up in some other database as well for whatever reason. So I started to do very simple attacks. I did grep. And I was grabbing for my contacts, so for my wife's phone number, my mother's email, across the system. And locations started to pop up that, hey, it's here and here and here and here and here, because those are not the default TCC protected places. So I had like 30 CVs just from this. It's really lame, but it worked. And Apple started to close these one by one. So all these locations were either added to the TCC protected locations, or Apple said, okay, we will not make a copy of the data anymore, and we'll make some other changes. And eventually, I think in Sonoma, Apple, in Sonoma, they said, okay, we will start protecting every single application container, which means basically closes most of these leaks universally. Now, only containers are protected by default. So if your application is not Sandbox, it doesn't have a container, so it will not have any protections like Chrome or like Firefox, or I think many of the other browsers. I really don't know why they are not Sandbox, but they are not. So they are just wide open. But if you have a Sandbox app, now TCC will protect the data you hold, basically. So this single step actually closed many of the open or maybe future bugs that might rise up with similar leaks. They also solved downgrade attacks. So if you, let's say, I don't know, you had Slack storing something, and you change Slack to your own version of Slack, signing it for yourself, and trying to like fake the bundle ID of Slack and say, hey, am I also Slack? Can I get access to that container? Apple will recognize it, and they will say, okay, it's a different application. Are you sure you want to continue to allow it to access that data? And you should say no. Now, another big area for TCC is the overlook of the mount operation. Between 2020 and 2023, I called it the golden era of mount attacks. You could do two tricks with mounting. Either mount over a specific directory and drop like a custom configuration file. So like drop a custom TCC database by mounting over the ComApple TCC directory where the TCC database is stored. Or drop a custom PEM configuration file. So the PEM config files, the PEMD folder became TCC protected, so you couldn't mess around with the those modules, but you could mount over the directory, so you could still drop your custom PEM plugin, and so on. So for some reason, the mount operation was overlooked in TCC, and there were a bunch of CVs from this. Also, the other part which was overlooked is where you could take a location or some data and mount it somewhere else. So the first one was mounting a time machine snapshot. So you could make a local time machine snapshot and mount it somewhere, and that wasn't TCC protected. So basically, by just doing a snapshot, you could access all of the private data through that snapshot mount. You could do the same trick with app translocation, etc. Now this is gone. Now, if there is any new location that goes under the TCC protection, it gets the mount protection as well. There are some exceptions, but it's really rare nowadays. So that attack is gone. Process injection, we heard a lot about this from Wojciech. Why you shouldn't inject to other processes. Basically, the reason is, again, if you can inject to another process, you can impersonate that process and access the same resources that process can. So basically, you can only inject if it's not hardened. if it's not a platform binary, if it's not entitled, or it has a get task allow entitlement. Now, back in macOS Mojave, hardened runtime wasn't a thing. I think even library validation wasn't a thing. You could just do dilib injection or dyd injection or task for bead, whatever. It was just wide. It was the wide west for third-party apps. And then Catalina came and they said notarization kicks in and hardened runtimes becomes mandatory, except for the App Store, as we heard. But nowadays, if you download any third-party process and they have some sketchy entitlements, they are not injectable anymore. So there are exceptions, but especially if you are Electron, that's just horrible. But normally, most of the applications are not injectable nowadays. So that's like a huge step for third-party application, not macOS itself, but for actual third parties. Also, I'm not sure where this came. I found out this recently. If you have any application in TCC, in privacy and security, under the developer tools, and it's specifically denied there, then you cannot get the task support of anything, even if you are root and the target is like an unsigned whatever. So it works like a block list for this. I'm not sure if it's intended or not, but it's still interesting. Launch constraints, my favorite. 2 years ago, I did a whole talk about this, so just a short recap on this, why it was introduced. So let's quickly review 2 exploits or vulnerabilities. There was a TCC bypass in the Imagent app. Basically, this is a built-in application with some keychain and TCC access, so your contacts and some keychain groups. Basically, what you could do, this application was looking for plugins in the contents plugins folder. Now, this application is in the system library location, so you cannot write to the plugins because of zip. But what you could do, make a copy of this application to your temp folder, drop a plugin, start the application, and done. You are running in the context of the application. Another one, sorry, that was found by Adam Chester. This one was found by Jonathan Baror from Microsoft. They called it PowerDir vulnerability. So basically, we have the config-d daemon, which is normally started by launch-d. But it also had an option to start it from the command line. And with the -b option, you could load a custom bundle. So you could load your own dilib into this process. And this process had the system policy sysadmin files entitlement, which allowed it to change some user settings. And basically, they could achieve full TCC bypass with this. So launch constraint came as a response to these type of attacks. It came in Ventura, and it mitigates many logic vulnerabilities. They define 3 constraints: self-constraint, which is a constraint to your process, parent constraints, and responsible constraints. So let's say I make a copy of my find my application to the temp directory and try to start that application. It will fail, and the reason for that is launch constraints. It defines various categories. So a category in launch constraints is a set of constraints specific to a binary. In Ventura, they had 7. Sonoma, we had 18, and we still have 18 since then. So it doesn't increase since that macOS version. Each binary in the trust cache is assigned to a specific category. And this is how category looks like. So category 1 defines a self-constraint, which means the application has to be either on an authorized APFS volume or on the system volume. So this means system partition or a cryptex launch type 1 means it's a system service, and validation category 1 means that it must be present in the trust cache. Now that's the application. The parent says is init pros, which means launch D. So basically this defines that the application or the binary this constraint relates to must be started by launch D, so you cannot start it from command line. It must be on the system partition, so you cannot make a copy of that, or on cryptex, of course. So basically this maps usually all the system daemons you have, because they are in the system partition and they are started by launch D. Another one, this one is less restrictive. It only says, okay, it must be on the system partition. So like all of the USR bin command line binaries, if you make a copy of like the ls binary, the list files, if you make a copy of that file to the temp directory, you cannot run it because of this. So basically, launch constraints solves a problem or an attack surface where you could make a copy of the application or invoke it from the command line with some weird settings which Apple doesn't want. So there might be vulnerabilities out there, but you can no longer exploit them. This was a major step, I think. And yeah, if you look at the specific examples, the image and app vulnerability, it wouldn't be possible because if you make a copy, you cannot start it. Config D, again, it has to be started by launch D, so you cannot invoke it from the command line. File operations. Now, there is a very nice attack we love as researchers. It's operating with symbolic links in time of check, time of use attacks. So let's say there is a binary or location the system wants to verify. It works with the file system path. You put a symlink in that path and redirect it to somewhere else. So the verification will happen on the redirected location. Once that happens, you quickly swap the symlink, and when it will start to use that path, it already points to somewhere else. This is a super common attack. Apple has an oh no follow flag, which means don't follow symlinks. The problem that this flag only checks the last component in the path, if the last component is a symlink. If I go back and if I make the directory, like the sum part, a symbolic link, this doesn't care. So I can still play around with symbolic links. Now in 2022, Apple introduced the oh no follow any flag, which means none of the path components can be a symbolic link. If you are a developer and you use file operations like C file operations like open, etc., use this flag unless you need symlinks for whatever reason. And Apple started to adopt this flag, and it's more and more widespread in their code, and it basically mitigates all of the symlink attacks. Weaponization paths. What is weaponization? So let's say this is where I turn an exploit into some useful code execution. So let's say I have a vulnerability where I can mount, let's say, anywhere on the file system. How do I use this to escape the sandbox, bypass TCC, elevate my privileges to root? Or let's say I have a vulnerability where I can drop a file anywhere on the file system. How do I turn this dropping a file into a full code execution? Or I can modify file permissions. Again, how do I do something useful with this? And there are some tricks, 6 that I want to cover here quickly. So let's say I can mount anywhere from the sandbox. let's say I can mount over, so I'm in the Sandbox application and I can mount anywhere. How do I escape the Sandbox? I could mount over library preferences and drop a new terminal preference. In the terminal preference file, I can set a command string which will be executed by terminal when you open it. Now, this can be like a full-blown shell script, or you can refer to another shell script, whatever. And basically, when you open terminal, that script will be executed, or that command, and that's already running outside of the Sandbox. So if you can mount anywhere from the Sandbox, this is how you achieve un-sandbox code execution. Now, this was closed in Sequoia because now the preferences directory is TCC protected. It's a problem because I had another bug where I could mount anywhere from the Sandbox. And I was like, how do I get code execution? And I found that, OK, it's a bit more difficult, but I can do another trick. I do two mounts. I do one over the ZSH sessions, and I do one over the saved application states. And I drop two files. One, a session file for terminal, which contains a script or whatever I want to execute in terminal. And the saved application states will have a reference to that session file that terminal will execute. Now I can open terminal and get code execution outside of the Sandbox. This was closed in later versions of Sequoia and Tahoe. Because the saved state was moved to another location, which is now TCC protected. And actually, this is so powerful that I now have like a vulnerability where I can mount outside of the Sandbox, but I cannot turn it into an unsandbox code execution. So closing these weaponization paths is really, really powerful from a protection point of view. So I still need to find another trick, which I haven't done. OK, another one. So let's say you can bypass zip to some extent. And I want to use it for bypassing TCC. So what I did in the past, I basically dropped the file in this location, this LO application list plist. Basically, it was like a hidden TCC database. If you added any entry into this list, like full disk access for terminal, it was taken into effect by TCC. They closed it in macOS Sequoia. This location doesn't exist anymore. This was there. This was needed a few years ago for some backward compatibility reason. But actually, this plist has been empty for years. So now it's just removed. OK, another one. Let's say I can mount anywhere or drop a file anywhere as root. How do I get code execution? One way was like I mount over the periodic scripts, and I wait for them to be executed as root. They closed this in multiple stages. On Big Sur, they made a change that they will execute those scripts with the file ownership. In Monterey, that location became TCC protected. And I think in Sonoma or Sequoia, periodic scripts are just gone. Another trick, let's say I can drop a file anywhere, even to root-owned location, but with user ownership, which means the user owns the file, but I can still write it anywhere I want. How do I get root code execution? And for a long time, it was possible that I drop a file to launch daemons, like a launchd plist file, and I do a reboot, and it was executed or loaded. Now, on Big Sur, Apple started to enforce ownership on that file. So if it wasn't owned by root, they did not load this. And the last one, again, I can drop a file anywhere as root, even with user ownership. dropping a new authentication file to the PEMD directory or changing an existing one basically allowed me to elevate myself to root without a password. It was closed in Big Sur because the directory became TCC protected. So to sum up, I think Apple is really raising the bar continuously. All the existing features gets improved. So kudos, honestly. Like literally in the past few years, my life is getting harder. And I said like, I have a vulnerability where I can mount anywhere outside the sandbox, but I cannot turn it into code execution because all of these mitigation. And exploiting logic vulnerabilities is getting harder and harder. And I didn't even talk about all the memory corruption mitigation because that's not my field. But even logic bugs are getting harder. So yeah, we are all safer now. To some extent. Thank you.